Often we're taught and challenged more by someone's example than by anything that that person might say about a particular subject. But in order for that to happen, of course, we have to take note of what the person does. And unfortunately, a lot of times I think we miss out because we don't notice. I think that happens sometimes when it comes to looking at the record of Jesus. What seems obvious is not so obvious. And today and the next 2 Sundays, I want us to look at the gospel accounts to learn what we can about Jesus and women. See, many readers of the Gospels have not taken notice of how Jesus treated women during his ministry, and because they haven't noticed, they've missed something extremely important. Now, not that Jesus is in heaven worrying about it, but I don't think he gets the credit that he deserves for elevating and enhancing the value of women. Today, what I want us to do is look at a variety of passages that will give us an overview of the subject. But to set the stage for what Jesus said and did, I want us to first consider the status of women in general during Jesus' time. Except for a very few exceptions in the larger Greco-Roman world, women were thought to be and treated as inferior to men. Historian Paul Johnson notes, women were almost invisible in the ancient Near East. They had little or no status unless married to rulers, and then their place was precarious. And somewhat surprising to me, that was also the general atmosphere with regard to the people of God in terms of the Jewish people. Middle Eastern scholar Kenneth Bailey suggests that during the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, a deterioration seems to have taken place regarding the place of women. In other words, by the time of Jesus, things had gotten worse with regard to women than they had been during the Old Testament. Bailey continues, the position of women by New Testament times was on all levels inferior to men. During the time of Jesus, the rabbis would not let women study the Torah, the Hebrew Scriptures. Only men could study the Bible. Women were not counted in order to have enough people to establish a synagogue in a village or a town. They could only count the men to see if there were enough people to establish a synagogue. In Jerusalem at the temple, the women's court for worship was 5 steps below the male court. I'll say a little bit more about this later, but the inferiority of women was such that only men could initiate and get a divorce. Only the husband. Women, wives, were not permitted to initiate or to get a divorce. And in Judaism, women were not permitted to be witnesses or to be called to testify in a court of law. Only men. And finally, with regard to the status of women in general during the time of Jesus, the prayer that the Orthodox Jew would pray on a daily basis was different for women than it was for men. An Orthodox Jewish male would pray daily, O Lord God, King of the universe, I thank you that you have not made me a Gentile. O Lord God, King of the universe, I thank you that you have not made me a slave. O Lord God, King of the universe, I thank you that you have not made me a woman. Now, an Orthodox Jewish woman would pray daily, O Lord God, King of the universe, I thank you that you have not made me a Gentile. O Lord God, King of the universe, I thank you that you have not made me a slave. O Lord God, King of the universe, I thank you that you have made me according to your will. Which seems to me to be a deeper prayer than any other prayer that a person might pray. Now, I do not share these things with you this morning to make you angry, especially the women here, or to suggest that women have it so much better now that they should never complain about being mistreated today. I just want us to know the general status of women during the time of Jesus so that we can realize just how radical the way he treated women really was. And in looking at the place of women during the time of Jesus, we can say, and not flippantly at all, it was indeed a man's world. Now, with that background before us, I want to explore some actions and words of Jesus that get our attention. And I think especially will get our attention today in light of what we've just said. I won't be able to cover everything that Jesus said and did, but this morning I want to look at 5 examples in the gospel record. And then next Sunday on Mother's Day, I want us to go really more deeply into a 6th example that is more familiar to us than these will be. And then in 2 weeks from today, I want to conclude this brief series by looking at an intriguing parable that Jesus told about women that in all of my years of Bible teaching and preaching, I have never studied and taught from. But I want us to look first at a parable that the point about women is so subtle that we probably wouldn't realize it was uncommon if it wasn't pointed out to us. In Luke chapter 15, the chapter begins with the Pharisees, the religious leaders of Jesus' day, criticizing him for welcoming and eating with sinners. And Jesus responds to their criticism by telling 3 parables in that chapter. The first parable is about a man who had 100 sheep, and he lost one of the sheep. Really, the text says the sheep wandered off, and that may be significant. And he left the 99 that were safely in the fold, went out and found the one that was lost, put him on his shoulders, brought him back in, called the neighbors in, and had a party because he'd found the sheep that had been lost. Now, the third parable we're familiar with is about a father who had 2 sons. The younger son requested his part of the inheritance before dad passed on. He gathered his inheritance, went off, and the King James Version says wasted his money in riotous living. And after he was broke, then he returned home to the warm welcome of his dad, but to the disappointment and anger of his older brother who had stayed there. And Jesus, of course, wanted the Pharisees who were criticizing him to identify with that older brother. But it's the second of these 3 parables that I want to look at today in Luke verses 8 to 10 in chapter 15. The second parable, Jesus says, suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin. In the same way, I tell you, there's rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Now, what would have been socially unsettling to those who heard this story is that the hero or the primary character in the story is a woman. And not only is the lead character in the story a woman, in this story, Jesus is comparing a woman searching for a coin that she lost in her house to God searching for lost people. That just did not happen, that comparison during the time of Jesus. Now, a second incident that offers more than just how Jesus treated a woman, but certainly does that as well, as this familiar scene in John chapter 4 when Jesus and his disciples are traveling through an area called Samaria. In John chapter 4, Jesus, left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now, he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, very important, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? Now, John tells us why Jesus was there at the well by himself when this woman came. His disciples had gone into town to buy food. They went to the local 7-Eleven or McDonald's or whatever it was. They're going to bring food back, and he was waiting. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Now, there's a couple of things going on here. One, John points out right here with regard to Jesus speaking to this woman, and that is that she was a Samaritan. And the hatred between the Jews and the Samaritans was so great that there would be no public exchange between a Jewish person and a Samaritan at that time. But it's more than that she was a Samaritan. And we have to go all the way down to verse 27 in this text to find out what's going on. Jesus is talking to this woman, and the conversation goes on. But John says in verse 27, "Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with, of all things, a woman." It was a woman he was talking to, but no one asked him. I like to say, no one had the nerve to ask him, "What do you want?" Or, "Why are you talking to her?" I mean, that's the implication here. Men did not speak to women in public, and especially a rabbi. But Jesus was no ordinary rabbi. Jesus was no ordinary man, was he? Third, I want to expand upon what we've already noted about divorce in first century Judaism and how what Jesus taught challenged the common practice. In Matthew chapter 19, there's this scene where the religious leaders come to test Jesus. When Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea to the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" That was the practice of the day. "Haven't you read," Jesus replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh.' So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." "Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" So the practice was when a man wanted to divorce his wife, he had to write out a certificate for her. That was a legal document showing that she was no longer married. It had all kinds of implications for the woman. Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery." See, earlier we made the point that only the husband could initiate a divorce, a woman could not. And the question here concerned the practice of that day. Where was Jesus with regard to this practice? That for any and every reason, I mean, if a man got tired of his wife, or she burned his toast, or her hair began to get gray, or whatever, he could just write her a certificate of divorce and be done with it. And in his response, Jesus did a couple of things. What we usually note about this is that he strengthened marriage and the commitment of marriage. Divorce was never God's intent for marriage. But beyond that, Jesus was protecting women here. Divorced woman would be in a very difficult situation in the first century, and really still to a great degree today. Jesus saying no. Absolutely no. A man cannot divorce his wife for just any and every reason. I think the most unfamiliar account about this matter of Jesus with women in the Gospels that I think will be new to some of you today is the report about some women followers of Jesus in Luke chapter 8 and verses 1 to 3. After this, Jesus traveled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. The 12 were with him. Now we know who the 12 are, the 12 apostles. And also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household. Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. Now, first is the very fact that there were women following Jesus at this time. As I said earlier, no rabbi would permit a woman to learn the Torah or to follow. And here, the 12 are with Jesus, we know that, but a group of women also. Now, there were no women that were in that group of 12 men who were handpicked by Jesus to be with him and closest to him and have the special responsibility that we read about in the early church of being apostles. And this report does not suggest otherwise. The 12 were with him, but there were also some women. And some may wonder why there were no women in that group of select men, those 12 that Jesus chose. Well, I think it seems rather obvious. It would be somewhat even obvious today in most circles that would not have been prudent. It would have lended itself to rumors and talk. It would not have been appropriate in any way. But what gets our attention here is that there were women in the larger group, that they were following Jesus and that they were learning from him. See, other rabbis did not teach women, but Jesus had women disciples. And not only that, these women were helping to support the ministry financially. They were paying part of the expenses for this traveling ministry team, and Jesus welcomed their support. But I think the greatest note of significance is perhaps that these women were supporting the ministry out of their own resources, or out of resources that were under their control, which would be very uncommon at that time. Uncommon that a group of women would be following Jesus, that they would be supporting the ministry financially, and it was out of funds that they had control over. We wish we knew more about them, don't we? There's one that we do know more about. This woman named Mary Magdalene. And that's the final thing I want us to note concerning Jesus' resurrection. Remember, it was a group of women who went that first Easter Sunday morning to the tomb to treat the body of Jesus. None of the male apostles went that Sunday morning. None of the men disciples went. All four Gospels tell us it was a group of women. And it was women who first learned of Jesus' resurrection from the angels who were there to give them the report. Now, we just celebrated Easter a couple weeks ago, but I want to read again John's account of this in John chapter 20 and verses 1 and following. Now, Mary, and this is Mary Magdalene. By the way, there are 4 different women named Mary in the gospel accounts. That's why it's so complicated to get this together. Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene are the 2 we know most about. Stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I've not yet ascended to my Father." Very significant. "Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am sending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. The resurrected Jesus appeared first to Mary Magdalene, a woman. Isn't it interesting? Jesus' first resurrection appearance wasn't to Peter, the leader of the apostles. It wasn't to any of the 12. Jesus didn't first appear to his enemies who had crucified him. He never did appear to them. Not to a king or any religious leader. Jesus did not even appear to a leader or any leaders of the future church, but to a woman. And not only did the resurrected Jesus appear first to a woman, he also gave her the job, the mission, and the privilege to be the first to tell others that Jesus was alive. One writer observes, we can only imagine what awe, wonder, joy, and yet fear flooded Mary at that moment. Because remember, in Judaism, women were not permitted to be witnesses or to testify in a court of law. They were not considered credible or trustworthy. Adam Warnock, a writer about the resurrection, lets us know this astonishing aspect of the resurrection story is very strong evidence for the genuineness of the account. No one would have invented an account so dependent on women as witnesses. You see what he's saying? If Jesus did not rise from the dead, as the critics say, and the disciples got together and cooked this story up, the last thing they would have cooked up is this harebrained idea that it was a woman who saw Jesus first raised from the dead and brought the report to the men. People would have laughed that off as something just crazy. But how fitting that the first thing Jesus did following his resurrection was to affirm the full dignity of women and the vital value of their witness. With these examples before us, I want to suggest a couple takeaways for our understanding. See, the way Jesus interacted with women, if we take the time to note, is extremely significant. I want to suggest to you this morning that the true women's movement did not begin in the early 20th century when women got the right to vote. And the true women's movement did not begin in 1963 when Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, was published. The true women's movement began with Jesus. And it's obvious primarily by his actions, but also through his words, that Jesus did not view and treat women as inferior to men, but rather as their equals. And the Gospels make it clear that Jesus respected women, that he was comfortable with women, that he knew how to communicate with women, and that he loved women as indeed he did men. In his dealings with women, Jesus was different from what would have been usual for a rabbi in the first century. But he did not condescend to women like other rabbis, but he treated them as persons who were valuable and who were loved by God. Jewish Christian Hugh Montefiore says Jesus is a great champion of womanhood. Many of us still have room to grow, to become like Jesus with regard to the value of women. And that includes not just men, but it includes also some women. Christians, followers of Jesus, should view and value women as he did. First, maybe in our minds to get it right, but then through our words and actions as we need to elevate women to their rightful place. And for some of us, that will begin in our very homes. And some of us, that needs to take place where we work. And for some of us, it needs to happen right here first, in our hearts. Women need to be seen and valued equal to men. Now, friends, that is not to say that men and women are the same. They aren't. The Bible clearly says God created humankind as male and female. And aren't you glad? Can you imagine what the world would be like if it were all women? but how much worse it would be if it was all men. But God made humankind men and women. They're not the same, they're different. But the Bible suggests that they are equal before God. Women have much to offer in every aspect of life, in society, in the workplace, and in the service of God and His church. Now, as the band comes, I want you to know I'm so thankful for the gospel accounts that tell us about Jesus, what He did and what He said. Aren't you? And what a privilege, what a blessing for us to read and reread what He did and said, and then to think about it and savor what He did and said. I never get tired of it, and I never am able to take it all in. And this morning, noting and reviewing what Jesus said about women and how He treated them is helpful. And I hope it's encouraging to us. I hope every woman here this morning is affirmed by what Jesus said and did. And I hope all of us are challenged and convicted to value women in general